For centuries, two Jewish communities have lived separate lives, one in Europe, the other in the Islamic world. They share the same faith, the same scriptures, yet their histories couldn't be more different. One group rose in royal courts, the other thrived in bustling trade centers. But a question remains: who are the real Israelites? To uncover the truth, we must go deep into history. Stay with us till the end, because this story will change everything you thought you knew. Imagine a time long before modern borders, before kingdoms and empires rose and fell. A time when a single people, bound by faith and tradition, walked the lands of Canaan, believing themselves chosen by destiny. These were the Israelites, the ancestors of millions who call themselves Jews today. But history is rarely kind. The story of the Israelites is not one of peaceful prosperity, but of struggle, exile, and survival against all odds. For centuries, they thrived under the rule of kings like David and Solomon, their magnificent temple standing as the heart of their identity. It was more than just a place of worship. It was proof of their divine connection. Every prayer, every festival, every hope centered around that sacred structure in Jerusalem. But in the year 70 CE, disaster struck. The Romans, a force so powerful they had already crushed entire civilizations, laid siege to Jerusalem. The streets ran red with blood as soldiers stormed the city. And then came the unthinkable. The Second Temple, the holiest site of the Jewish people, was set ablaze. The fire roared into the night, swallowing centuries of devotion in its flames. For the Israelites, it was more than destruction. It was the breaking of their world. Survivors were scattered. Some were taken as slaves, forced to march in chains through the streets of Rome as trophies of war. Others fled, carrying only the hope that someday, somehow, they would return. This event marked the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, a painful dispersion that would shape the future of an entire people. Over time, the Israelites took different paths. Some journeyed westward, settling in Spain, North Africa, and the lands of Islam. Others moved north, finding refuge in the cold landscapes of Europe. These migrations planted the seeds of what would later become the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, two branches of the same tree, growing in opposite directions. Yet, as generations passed, the question remained: were they still one people? Did time, distance, and hardship create two separate nations, or did the soul of the Israelites live on in both? To answer that, we must travel across centuries, through golden ages and dark times, into the heart of a divide that still lingers today. The deeper we go, the more haunting the truth becomes. The temple had burned, the streets of Jerusalem had turned to ash, and the Israelites had been torn from their homeland. Some were dragged to the heart of the Roman Empire, enslaved and humiliated. Others scattered, carrying nothing but the weight of their past. Their world had collapsed, but their spirit refused to die. Time moved forward, and those who had once walked the hills of Judea now found themselves in foreign lands. Among them, a group settled in a place that would become their new home: the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. Here, they became known as the Sephardic Jews, named after Sepharad, the Hebrew word for Spain. At first, life in Spain was uncertain. The land was ruled by the Visigoths, a people who saw the Jews as outsiders. Persecution, forced baptisms, and expulsions became common. It seemed as if history was repeating itself. Another land, another exile. But fate had other plans. In the 8th century, the armies of Islam swept across Spain, and everything changed. Under Muslim rule, a new era began, one of opportunity, learning, and cultural flourishing. The Sephardic Jews, no longer shackled by oppression, rose to prominence. They became doctors, scholars, poets, and philosophers. Their synagogues were filled with prayer, their books filled with knowledge. The world had never seen such a golden age for the Jewish people. Men like Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and physician, changed the course of history with his wisdom. Others delved into astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, their knowledge shaping the future of Europe itself. Sephardic Jews spoke Ladino, a language born from their unique blend of Hebrew and Spanish. Their culture, music, and traditions thrived under the crescent moon of Al-Andalus. By the 15th century, Christian kings had begun to reclaim Spain, and with them came a dark shadow, the Spanish Inquisition. What had once been a land of learning became a place of terror. The Inquisition demanded one thing: conversion or death. The Sephardic Jews, who had once flourished, now faced their greatest nightmare. Families were torn apart. Synagogues were burned. The same land that had once welcomed them now hunted them. In 1492, the Edict of Expulsion was issued. The Jews of Spain had a choice: convert to Christianity or leave everything behind. Thousands fled, seeking refuge in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and the Middle East. Those who stayed, forced to convert, lived in fear of the Inquisition's spies. Sephardic Jews scattered across the world, carrying their language, traditions, and sorrow with them. Yet, despite everything, they never forgot who they were. They had once been Israelites, then Spanish Jews, and now exiles once more. Their fate was tragic, but their resilience was unbreakable. While the Sephardic Jews wandered, another group had been carving out a different path. A path that led through the bitter cold of Europe, through the ghettos and the pogroms, through a history shaped by suffering and survival. These were the Ashkenazi Jews, and their story was just as haunting. The Sephardic Jews had lost their golden age, their synagogues reduced to ashes, their books burned by those who once sought their wisdom. Forced into exile, they scattered across the world, carrying their history like an unhealed wound. But while their story unfolded under the scorching sun of Spain and North Africa, another chapter of Jewish survival was being written. One far colder, far harsher, and even more unforgiving. In the heart of medieval Europe, another Jewish community was rising. They would later be known as the Ashkenazi Jews, a people whose journey was not defined by golden ages, but by endless struggle. It began in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, in present-day Germany and France. Jewish merchants and traders, seeking refuge from past exiles, settled along the banks of the Rhine River. They built homes, communities, and places of worship, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this land would finally let them live in peace. From the very beginning, the Jews were seen as outsiders, their customs unfamiliar, their faith unwelcomed. The medieval Christian world was suspicious, often blaming them for plagues, disasters, and even the wrath of God. Whispers turned into accusations. Accusations turned into massacres. During the Crusades, as Christian warriors marched toward the Holy Land, they turned their swords against Jewish communities along the way. Entire villages were slaughtered, men, women, and children alike. In cities like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, the Rhine ran red with Jewish blood. The Ashkenazi Jews had no armies, no kingdoms to protect them. They had only each other. Survival meant adaptation. They withdrew into tightly knit communities, shielding themselves from the outside world. Their faith grew stronger, their traditions more deeply rooted. And so, a new culture was born, one built on resistance and resilience. They spoke Yiddish, a language that mixed Hebrew with German, a tongue of exile and survival. The Jews of Europe became wanderers once again. Pushed further eastward, kingdoms like Poland, Ukraine, and Russia opened their gates, offering refuge, for a time. There, the Ashkenazi Jews found a new home, but it came at a cost. They lived in shtetls, small, isolated villages where they were safe but separate. For centuries, life in the shtetls was simple yet fragile. Families lived in wooden houses, prayed in hidden synagogues, and studied Torah by candlelight. They built a world within a world, knowing that at any moment, history could turn against them again. The pogroms came, violent, brutal massacres ordered by kings and encouraged by mobs. Homes were burned, synagogues destroyed, families torn apart. The Ashkenazi Jews had escaped one nightmare only to find themselves trapped in another. Yet, like their Sephardic brothers, they never gave up. They carried their faith, their stories, and their pain across generations. Their suffering became legend. Their endurance became their strength. Two peoples, two histories. One question remained. Who were the real Israelites? For centuries, the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews had walked different paths. One had endured the Golden Age and the flames of the Inquisition. The other had survived the cold ghettos and merciless pogroms of Europe. Two histories, two struggles. But at the heart of it all, one question remained. Who were they truly? Both groups had held on to their Jewish identity with unwavering devotion. They had prayed in different tongues, Ladino in the West, Yiddish in the East, but the words always led to the same God. They had built separate worlds, yet each generation still whispered the same stories of Jerusalem, of the temple that once stood, of the homeland they had lost. But now, modern science was stepping in. Could DNA reveal the truth? Could it answer the question that history could not? As genetic studies advanced, researchers began to unravel the origins of the Jewish people. They examined thousands of DNA samples from Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, tracing their lineage back through time. The results were both fascinating and controversial. Most Jewish groups, regardless of where they lived, shared genetic markers that traced back to the Levant, the ancient land of Israel. This was no small discovery. It meant that despite centuries of separation, despite exile and migration, the blood of the ancient Israelites still ran through their veins. The Sephardic Jews, who had lived in Spain and the Islamic world, showed a stronger genetic link to the Middle East and North Africa. They had intermarried less with European populations, keeping their lineage closer to their ancient roots. Many still carried the DNA of the first Israelites who had once walked the streets of Jerusalem. The Ashkenazi Jews, however, told a more complex story. While they too had strong Middle Eastern ancestry, their genes also carried traces of European influence, especially from Italy and Eastern Europe. This raised a provocative question. Had some of their ancestors converted to Judaism? Then came the most controversial theory of all, the Khazar hypothesis. Some historians and researchers suggested that a portion of the Ashkenazi Jewish population might have descended from the Khazars, a Turkic people who ruled over a vast empire in southern Russia during the Middle Ages. According to this theory, the Khazar elite converted to Judaism, and their descendants became part of the Ashkenazi Jewish community. But DNA studies largely debunked this claim. There was little evidence linking Ashkenazi Jews to the Khazars. Instead, their genetic roots pointed back to the same origin as the Sephardic Jews, the ancient Israelites. Science had answered part of the mystery. Both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews had their origins in the land of Israel. The differences between them were shaped by history, not by ancestry. Would DNA be enough to bridge it? Or was the question of identity something far greater than blood? The DNA had spoken. Science had proven that both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews shared the same ancient origins, descendants of the Israelites who once walked the streets of Jerusalem, who once prayed at the Grand Temple before it was lost to history. For centuries, these two Jewish communities had lived separate lives, shaped by the lands that adopted them. Spain and the Islamic world for the Sephardim, Christian Europe for the Ashkenazim. Their cultures evolved, their languages changed, and their customs took on the flavors of the civilizations around them. And so, even though they prayed to the same God and read from the same Torah, they became different people. A language is more than just words. It is history, memory, and survival. And the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews carried their pasts in their tongues. The Sephardic Jews spoke Ladino, a beautiful blend of Hebrew and medieval Spanish, laced with influences from Arabic, Turkish, and Portuguese. It was the language of their golden age, the language they took with them when they were forced into exile. Even after Spain had banished them, their speech carried the echoes of Andalusian palaces, bustling markets, and distant memories of home. The Ashkenazi Jews, on the other hand, spoke Yiddish, a fusion of Hebrew and medieval German, mixed with Slavic and other Eastern European influences. It was the language of the shtetls, the language whispered in candlelit rooms as families huddled together in times of fear. To outsiders, Yiddish sounded strange, almost secretive. But to the Ashkenazim, it was the voice of their ancestors, the rhythm of their survival. Two languages, born from exile. One from the warmth of Spain, the other from the cold of Europe. Religious traditions. The battle between old and new, though both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, followed Jewish law, halakha. Time and distance shaped their interpretations. The Sephardic tradition remained closer to its Middle Eastern roots. It emphasized logic, philosophy, and reasoned debate in its approach to religious law. Sephardic scholars like Maimonides sought to blend faith with science, seeing no contradiction between the two. The Ashkenazi tradition, however, took on a stricter, more mystical approach. Separated from the Islamic world's culture of scholarship, their rabbis emphasized deep textual analysis, often seeing religious law as something unchangeable and absolute. This led to stricter rules, heavier restrictions, and a greater sense of separation from non-Jews. But the real difference lay in how they viewed each other. When Sephardic Jews encountered their Ashkenazi brethren, they saw them as rigid, isolated, and overly strict. They believed Ashkenazim had turned Judaism into something fearful, something disconnected from the beauty of knowledge and philosophy. Ashkenazi Jews, in return, saw the Sephardim as too relaxed, too influenced by the outside world. To them, Sephardic traditions felt dangerously close to assimilation. Two brothers, descendants of the same people, yet standing on opposite sides of a growing divide. For centuries, Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews had walked separate paths, speaking different languages, following different traditions, and viewing each other with quiet suspicion. Yet, despite their differences, they shared the same longing, the dream of returning to the land from which they had once been exiled. And then, after nearly 2,000 years of wandering, suffering, and survival, that dream became a reality. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of Jewish migrants began returning to the land of their ancestors, Palestine, the land that held the ruins of the ancient Israelite kingdoms. They came driven by hope, but also by fear. Persecution in Europe was growing worse, and for the Ashkenazi Jews, the horrors of the Holocaust would soon wipe out millions of their people. When Israel was officially declared a state in 1948, it was meant to be a home for all Jews, a land where Sephardic and Ashkenazi differences would finally dissolve, where exile would no longer define them. The Ashkenazi Jews, who had arrived in Israel first and had deep ties to European Zionist leaders, quickly took control of the new nation's politics, institutions, and economy. They built the government, ran the universities, and dictated the cultural narrative of what it meant to be an Israeli. The Sephardic Jews, who arrived in massive waves from the Middle East and North Africa in the 1950s, expected to be welcomed as brothers. Instead, they were treated as outsiders in their own homeland. They were placed in remote, underdeveloped towns, far from the thriving cities. Many were forced to abandon their rich traditions, their Ladino and Arabic languages, and were told that their customs were less sophisticated than Ashkenazi ones. The state even took Sephardic children from their families, attempting to modernize them in Ashkenazi schools. Painful memories still haunt the older generations. For decades, this divide remained deep. Sephardic Jews fought for recognition, for dignity, for a place at the table in the land that was meant for all of them. But time has begun to heal the wounds. Today, intermarriage between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews is common, and a new generation is emerging, one that sees beyond the divisions of the past. Yet the question remains: has the divide truly disappeared, or is it simply hidden beneath the surface? The land of Israel was meant to be a home for all Jews, a place where centuries of exile, suffering, and division would finally end. But even after their return, the divide between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews remained. And so, the question still lingers in whispers and debates. Who are the real Israelites? Is it the Sephardic Jews, whose traditions remained closer to the ancient Middle Eastern roots? The ones who kept the echoes of the past alive, speaking languages laced with Hebrew, preserving customs untouched by European influence? The ones who lived among Arabs and Persians, much like their ancestors once lived among the Canaanites and Babylonians? Or is it the Ashkenazi Jews, who endured the unthinkable, from medieval massacres to the horrors of the Holocaust, yet never let their identity fade? The ones who rebuilt themselves after every tragedy, carrying Jewish scholarship, faith, and resilience into the modern world. The ones who led the charge in reclaiming the land, turning the dream of Israel into a reality. The truth is, this is not a battle of legitimacy. Neither group holds a stronger claim to the name Israelite. They are two branches of the same tree, grown in different directions but rooted in the same ancient past. The Torah they study, the prayers they whisper, the longing they share. These are not separate stories. They are one. Perhaps the real question is not who the real Israelites are, but rather, when will they finally see that they always were one people? For centuries, history pulled Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in opposite directions. Wars, exiles, and foreign lands shaped them into two distinct peoples, separate in culture, divided by experience. But no matter how far they traveled, how different they became, their prayers remained the same. They turned toward Jerusalem, whispering the same ancient words. They mourned the same destruction, longed for the same redemption. The world tried to break them, yet they survived. Now, in modern Israel, the divide still lingers. Old wounds have not fully healed, and past injustices are not easily forgotten. But something is changing. A new generation is rising, one that no longer sees two separate Jewish worlds, but one united people. Is it blood, DNA, and ancestry? Or is it the shared history of suffering and survival? Is it the unwavering faith that no exile, no war, no force on earth could erase? The truth is clear. They were always one people. And maybe, just maybe, the time has come to finally see each other as brothers once more. If this story made you think, if it helped you understand history in a new way, then don't let the journey end here. Subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening historical mysteries. Like the video if you found this story powerful. And most importantly, watch till the end. Because history is not just the past. It is the key to our future.